a big believer in the initial part of private pilot training that the student really shouldn't land the sim. That is a real, I mean, I'm a romantic, that's a real magical thing, right? That learning to land and the feeling in your pants when you get the flare, and when they make the connection, when the neurons connect the right way and you actually understand what it should feel like, that's a really important thing. And our sim, anyone's sim, even level D sims, don't do a great job at that flare. Once they have it down, sure, let them land the sim, no problem. Before they have it down, we can talk about teaching them the procedures, how to go around the pattern. We can talk about setting up for an approach. When they're on final, we can talk about how to adjust our rate of descent. The sim is great at all that kind of stuff, but it's what I'm specifically talking about is the flare. When they get close to the runway and they pull back, I want to keep that for the airplane. If you have them well prepared, when you go out to the airplane, it can happen very quickly. If they know the procedures for going around the pattern, if they know the procedures for how to get set up for the landing, when they get into the actual airplane, all they're really learning in the airplane is that feeling, and it can move very quickly. The other one, and this is my, talk about soapbox, this is my soapbox. I have a major, honestly, I have a major issue with the way we teach stalls and edge of the envelope training to a lot of private pilots now. So part of my background, I'm part owner in a T6 Texan, do a lot of aerobatics flying, and I grew up with my dad, he loves flying aerobatics, so I grew up flying at the edge of the envelope, and your average private pilot, especially now when when we talk about stall A, they're terrified of them, even after they get their rating, and B, they may take it to what a first indication, I think, is what the terminology is. And in normal situations, in a training environment, first indication is a stall warning horn. But there are lots of situations where first indication is an airframe buffet. And the stall warning horn is not actually going to go off. Things like accelerated stalls, because of the way the air is moving over the wing, you're going to feel it in the elevator before you ever feel it, before you ever hear it on the wing. And I think that that is a situation that we've created in the way we're teaching stalls that is unfortunate. So, with that said, don't teach the stall buffet in the simulator. I would suggest teaching it. I would suggest going beyond power on, power off stalls with a private pilot student. I would suggest falling leaps and accelerated stalls and turning stalls. Let them see what a stall is not about airspeed. A stall is about angle of attack, and let them get that experience. But if you're really teaching them, okay, we're going to do an accelerated stall and I want you to feel for the vibration, our sim is not going to do that. You should do that in your plane. That's a real niche thing, I get that, but it's my soapbox. And the other thing is when we get into the spin, you can spin a Redbird, it's kind of hard, but you can spin it. Its behavior in the spin it's just off the charts. It's nowhere near. And that's because you are no longer flying. Our aircraft model is built for flying. You are falling, and it doesn't really simulate that very good. But the procedures to pop out of the spin work. You're right, so you can teach spin recovery procedures. But if you are the type of instructor that would like to have a student spin, or at least experience the entry to a spin, that should be done in an aircraft that's capable of that.
Will the simulator drop a wing?
Not necessarily, no. It will not, and that's the thing about 172 that will so get pilots. The thing is like a baby 99.9% of the time, except in right turn with the wrong rudder and full power, it will pop a wing over on you, and it'll catch you off guard. So I'm not telling you to spin your airplanes, but if you're inclined to, go do it in the real thing. And then aircraft ground handling. I used to say taxiing, but I've been corrected many times that the sim is great at teaching taxiing, because taxiing is more than just moving around on the ground. It's understanding the signage on the airport, getting a clearance, and being able to look at an airport diagram and say, I'm here and I need to be here. Those are all wonderful things to teach in the simulator, in the Redbird. What I'm specifically talking about is pushing the rudder pellets, so to maneuver on the ground. And that's just a artifact of the way our simulation engine works. It does not really get the difference between flying and on the ground. There's a little flag that gets turned on that says on ground. And what that really does is it increases the heck out of the rudder sensitivity. And so you Zamboni around on the ground. You don't turn an arc. Like even an airplane with no nose wheel steering is still got wheels when it's still turning an arc. Our sim does not do that. It slides around. So if it's the first time that like taxiing with a new student is difficult anyways, most people just, it does not make sense. And you put them in the sim and you have them do it the first time, it's gonna make even less sense. So I would do that, you know, honestly that's 1 or 2 lessons of maneuvering on the ground and they'll get it. But all the other parts of taxiing are fully, you know, really good things to do in the sim. So any questions about what we wanna do in the sim and what we don't wanna do in the sim? Make sense? Okay. Keys to instructing in a Redbird. It's the biggest obstacle to effective training in a Redbird. Anybody? Money? Okay. Okay. Access? Okay. Yeah. So if you have access and you have money, let's say, what is the thing that would make the biggest obstacle to that training? You book an hour, you get in there with a student or an instructor. What's the biggest thing that's going to make that hour effective or not?
Instructor familiarity.
Instructor familiarity? Okay, well, you're a great audience because those are all, right, it's the instructor, honestly. In most environments, the instructor doesn't want to be there. They don't value it because it doesn't go in their logbook. They just don't want to be there. And it immediately translates to the student. If the student picks up that, oh, we just have to do the box today because we don't have good enough weather to fly. That statement is so toxic if it's the first time that person's been in the sim or the second time that person has been in the sim. What you want to say is, we have an awesome opportunity to really learn some new stuff. This training that we're about to do is valuable and I want you to take it seriously. That's what the instructor needs to communicate. The students are coming in the door and 80, 90% of them come from the default position of, that's a tool that I can use to be better and it will help me. And where they pick up the idea that it's a waste of time and you only do it when there's bad weather is from their instructor. And so the real key to getting good training out of it is you have to have a good attitude. The instructor has to have a good attitude about it. The other thing I'll say is, and a lot of this is really around the idea of we want to suspend reality for the time that they're in there. So realism matters, and by realism I mean both the actual simulator, right? It's got to fly somewhat like an airplane. It's got to have avionics that are somewhat like an airplane, and that's on us. You know, that's not something that y'all control. But I also mean procedural realism. So put the seatbelt on. All of our big sims have a seatbelt. Even if you don't have motion, even with the motion on, you're never going to fall out of it, right? It doesn't move that. But you would never get in an airplane and not put the seatbelt on. Put a headset on, yeah.
How valid is the crosswind landing and takeoff model?
In the like FMX or an MCX, it's good. It's not like you totally can teach the procedures, but really, honestly, anything landing related is going to be in the ballpark of right. You know, it's not going to be like you do it 5 times in the sim and you go out in the airplane and you got it down. You can definitely teach procedures and you can give them a lot of approaches and you can give them a lot of opportunities to get lined up on the runway and to kick out whatever correction you're putting in when you land or hold if they're doing wing low. All that stuff works, but again, the flare, it's not great. I mean, it's not, and it's never going to be just because of the way we're displaying a 2D image on a screen in front of you. Once you get close enough to the ground, you have a serious lack of depth perception. That unless we wanted to do commingulated displays and charge you all $1 million for visual, you just won't get anything. You're not going to get depth perception without that.
You know, we recently got the 4K monitors along with Prepare 3D, and we're hoping to get version 5 here not much longer. And frankly, the depth perception is pretty dramatically
It's better. Yeah, good.
just the notion.
Yeah.
Simulation doesn't work like couldn't give you a clean.
So on that, I would say put the seatbelt on, put the headset on, talk over the intercom, pre-brief the flight. No pilot would ever get in the airplane without at least thinking about what's the weather? What runway am I going to take off from? 80%, 90% of instructors will get in the sim and never tell the student what weather to expect. There's just simple stuff like that. Pre-brief the weather, put your headset on, will help. Okay, the most important button in our simulator or any simulator is pausing. Is the pause button, and it is a great tool to be able to pause. Most of the time it gets overused, especially in the instrument training environment. Once somebody's got procedurally, they know what they're doing. They know this is the next thing I should be doing, and what you're working on is practicing it or adding in other elements or you know, expanding a skill set that's already there. You don't really want to pause it because you want to feel that student to have a little bit of anxiety about, I'm behind the airplane, I'm behind the airplane. Because they're gonna get it in the airplane. I think every pilot who's ever learned how to fly has had that feeling of, I'm behind the airplane, I'm behind the airplane. And it's a skill to recognize that and get ahead of it from there. And the simulator is a great place to practice that skill. And so pausing, I think about it in terms of, is the student learning still? If they're still learning, let it run. Even if they're behind, if they're still learning, let it run. And you can tell if you've sat with a student when their memory gets completely maxed out, and it's like, you know, your PC just lock screens, right? You've been with students who have locked screen. Pause. That's the time to pause. Let them reset, reevaluate, either start over or see if we can get them to catch up. But as long as there's still valuable learning happening, let it run. And this is really abused by the students. If you end up I highly suggest letting people get in the sim by themselves after they've gone through training with an instructor, and let them do independent practice, or even, you know, lightly supervised practice where the instructor's outside, maybe working with another student that can check in and out. But the students will pause as soon as it gets uncomfortable. And that's one of the things that they can pick up from an instructor that's really eager to pause as well. So that it is an important button, and it's kind of an art form to know. And it's really why we have instructors. We have human beings who can read the behavior and the body language of another human being and apply it correctly. At Skyport, this was our sort of, we had to sum up how we would do things in an environment, a heavy sim-focused environment for ab initio training or for instrument training. This is it. You learn the maneuver, the procedure on the ground. It's taught to you on the ground with an instructor, computer-based learning, whatever it is. You practice it in the simulator and you perform it in the airplane. We get questions all the time about how to integrate a simulator into a curriculum, and it's kind of flippant, but the easy answer is never do something in the airplane that you haven't done in the simulator. That's it. So if you're, there's no student is gonna pick up a maneuver in one attempt, right? So you know you're gonna at least do 2 steep turns. You have the world's best student pilot, you're probably gonna do 2 steep turns. Do the first one in the simulator. And they nail it, great, let's go out to the airplane. The same thing for an instrument rating. Do not do, you want the airplane is just such a terrible place to learn procedural stuff. It's a fire hose, it's loud, there's threat of life and limb, you know? We talked about this in my earlier presentation. When you have feedback, instant feedback is super important to learn. That's how you reinforce lessons, is when as soon as something happens, they get feedback on it, right? It's how you teach a 4-year-old the way to behave. It's, you know, that's super important. And in an airplane, even if the instructor is right next to you and you do a maneuver and they give you instant feedback, part of your brain has to be allocated to flying that airplane. You know, good instructors will say, my airplane, and let the student sit there and they'll give them some feedback. That's better, but the best, student simulator, they complete the maneuver, pause. Okay, let's talk about that. You did this, you did that, you did this, unpause, do it again. That's really one of the big advantages. And the airplane should be a place where you demonstrate proficiency, mastery of the maneuver. I'll show this slide at the end as well, but these are just sort of 9 rules that we put together. A lot of them are repeats of them, just stated the other way, a different way. But instructors must reinforce the value of the training, especially early on. The instructor has to demonstrate that they think that this is important to do. Then have a goal for every training event. What you're really trying to avoid is the video game. And it's really easy to get into it, but we would have these situations where we had very documented, very clear lesson plans that the instructors were supposed to follow with their students, and the students were supposed to follow if they were in the sim independently. And like 10% of people will take that, and 30 minutes in, you'll go walk by, and they're doing the loops down the Vegas Strip in the simulator. Well, we have now passed beyond valuable training into the realm of video games. And once you start getting there, and it becomes a repeated habit, that student's just not going to pick up much from the sim going forward. And then brief every simulator session can be really easy. You can say, it'll be VFR today. I'm not expecting any weather. These are the things we're going to accomplish. This is the standard I'm looking for. Maybe a 5-minute conversation, but do that just like you would, hopefully would, before you got in the airplane. So when I say use real-world weather, I'm going to show an example of this, but like most pilots, pretty much the first thing I do in the morning is I check aviation weather. Depending on, I use ForeFlight, depending on what you use. When I was instructing actively, at the time it was ADDS, I would take screenshots of interesting weather, and I would put them in a binder of the weather pattern, the radar, the METAR, the TAF, and then we would make scenarios to match those weather conditions. And not just interesting in that this weather is a gotcha. Interesting in it's 5,000 overcasts, and we have a front coming in over the next 12 hours. Very common situation. And what's important that we'll talk about at some point here, I really think that every lesson in the simulator should have weather in it. Unfortunately, the default flight for Lockheed Martin Prepared is 50 miles of visibility, clear skies, totally unrealistic, and what happens then is if that's what the weather is every time they get in the simulator, the time you say we're going to introduce a weather decision point is the only time they get in and there's weather. And they go, I bet I'm going to have to worry about those clouds at some point. So build the habit of, it's 20 miles visibility. It's not bad, but there is there's a noticeable visibility restriction. There's clouds up at 10,000 feet. It's not fine VFR day, but there is weather in the scenario. And then on another, if it's early in the training and you're working on steep turns, or if it's instrument training, put the clouds down at 3,000 feet and have them, or 5,000 feet for VFR, and have them maneuvering under an overcast layer. You're not going to do anything early in the training, but you're setting it up for later when you do start to do stuff with them on the weather. These headsets and seatbelts, we talked about that, and then keeping these next 3 are sort of all related, but keeping your failures realistic, limiting them to about 20% of the sessions, and never creating inescapable situations. I think what ends up happening with a lot of instructors, even if they don't have an airline background, They've heard stories of airline-style training in the simulator where you get in the sim and it just all falls apart, right? It's like terrible weather and everything's breaking, and that's what they think sim sessions should be. And at the professional level, that is what sim sessions should be. They've demonstrated that that's good. Early on in the training, what you don't want the student to learn is that the simulator is always going to be off. And that especially what you don't want them to learn is there is no possible decision I can make that will get me out of this successfully. You have these instructors that'll put in thunderstorms. There'll be an IFR, IFR check, right? And the guy's flying through thunderstorms down to minimums with an alternator failure. And then, oh, by the way, when you land, the right brake has failed. So even if you get it on the ground, you hit the brakes, you're going to veer off, right? Like, there's no, that is not a situation for a soon-to-be instrument-rated pilot. He's not going to learn that much out of that. So we don't create those situations, and we know when to pause. Questions?
A lot of people come in for currency training and want to get their 6 approaches in and hold. And is there anything in particular that you would recommend for that? I'll tell you what I do. I've got 30 approaches in the St. Louis area, all different airports, different conditions, runways, but each one's different. And they all start above the airplane, above the initial approach fix, and when they get there, it's IMC and right down to minimums in every case. That's the only thing that's the same now. And I get a resistance to that because guys will come in and say, my personal minimums are 802. Do I let them? I guess I can let them. That's IMC actually.
Yeah. I mean, it counts. It's a legal approach, right? Any portion of the published approach inside of IMC makes it a legal approach. What I would suggest honestly is ask them where they fly. Like, what do they do normally? Do the 3 approaches, what they do normally, and then build some scenarios in San Francisco. Someplace they would never fly, on approaches they've never flown, and have some maybe 1 or 2 of those approaches has the 802, and one of them goes all the way down to minimums. And say, if you're serious about this and you want to get better, right? I'm going to go with the assumption that it's not just literally checking the box, but like you're here, you might as well learn something. Make sure they do the ones that they do frequently, because it's important for them to go through that habit pattern, because that's the key to airline safety, honestly, is that it's repeatable habit forming. So have them do the ones that they do, but then I would throw in just a little bit of variation, and they might enjoy it, and it's not like they can fail, right? Like, as far as the FAA is concerned, if they get on that approach and fly it, they're fine. They're not gonna take even if they crash into the runway at the end, it still counts for currency. So let them experience something different. That would be my suggestion.
I was going to mention what I occasionally do, I often do, is find a place that has bad weather. Seattle, for example, is a good one. And then they get the airport diagram for Seattle, so this is something new to them. It's not their home airport. Here's the weather for Seattle. How is that different from where I taught a lot in New Mexico, and there's no weather in New Mexico. The other thing is the thing that you're doing it right. I love what you've got here because you really have it set up nicely. But the one thing you can't teach, and there's a few things like this, is the very first time they break out on top. Every time I've had a student break out on top for the first time, they become exuberant. The beauty of it, how quickly wow, and there's those clouds underneath. So some things, the simulator has you set to a certain degree of expectation. When the real thing happens, it's way beyond that.
Agreed, totally. I mean, that's some of the nice things about flying. Anybody else have any questions? Comments? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about using real world weather. Like I kind of hinted on this, but this is one I did for more recently using ForeFlight. but this would be a fine, you could use this for, honestly, you could use this for an IFR, this weather pattern for an IFR or VFR student. It's really, there's a learning opportunity here especially for an IFR student. But this is a flight from KEDC, Austin Executive, to KCLL, College Station, Texas, Gig Maggie's. In October, 1 o'clock, IFR flight rules. If you look at, we get our flight plan from 4Flight, and this is, I just found a weather day that I liked, put it in there, screen cap, you know, and you could save it on an iPad and have them pull it up and it would look like what we're doing. We got little headwinds, and this is the important bit. There's this front out here in the panhandle with a little low behind it, and there's some precipitation. If we look at the current weather, we're pretty solid IFR at EDC, which is a very common thing. When you have this situation, you get a bunch of moisture that's coming off the Gulf, and in central Texas, that turns into low clouds and pretty low visibility that burns off. They're thin, a couple thousand feet, and they burn off. Everything's, in the area is kind of a mix of IFR and VFR. And the forecast at Austin Exec, which is the closest airport that gets a METAR, is we have some temporary stuff, and then it's supposed to burn off by 1600 Zulu, which is before our flight, and be 6 miles and scattered at 5,000. And VFR, when we get to College Station, we're expecting a VFR flight. You can have them do this and say, this is the weather preview you got at 8 a.m. this morning when you filed. You filed early. You get to the airport, it's still overcast, and it's a little broken. And then you get out, and what the flight actually does is it's solid IFR all the way there because it hasn't burned off yet, which happens. You can also adjust this in a way where that front is moving faster. And so on the return trip from College Station, let's say this was the outbound leg, you go to College Station, and you don't have to fly the whole way, right? It'd take an hour. You take off, we have I forget what it's called, orbit, whatever, the reality mode where you zoom ahead. You get to College Station, you shoot the approach, you say, okay, you spent some time there, now you take off again, and it's broken, but over the course of the flight, when you pick the winds up, you start adding, and then you can start adding in thunderstorms. By the time they get to Austin, that front has moved through. They are attempting an approach in somewhat significant weather, especially for a new instrument pilot. Or none of that could happen, right? So for this weather situation, I'd probably create 2 or 3 scenarios, and it could be just fine. They could get to the airport and it's broken, overcast, and by the time they get to College Station, it's clear. And that's fine, because you're not teaching weather in that situation, right? You're teaching the IFR procedure that you're focused on. But this gives you the flexibility as an instructor to add those things in during the course of their training. So we got some more information. So our approach path. So before we move on, any questions on what I mean by real world weather? This is the kind of thing, honestly, that your standard line instructor is not going to do. But if you're putting together a curriculum or working on your syllabus, it really doesn't take, especially if it's based on training in your local area, it doesn't take that much effort for somebody that's working on that to every morning just look at the weather forecast, see could there be some interesting weather develop out of this that I could use in the sim. But you really, really want weather in the sim every time you get in it of some kind. Okay, so this is my favorite VFR, probably one of my favorite VFR training tasks. If you've ever taught a private pilot how to enter a pattern, that is, maybe it's just me, but that is one of the more frustrating moments of new flight training. And we're flying 15 miles away from an airport, and they have no idea how they're going to enter on midfield or 45 to downwind, and you sit there, and you sit there, and you sit there, and they're trying to figure it out, and it's frustrating. And what's even more frustrating is that they probably only do that once or twice a flight at most. And so that frustration might last for 10 lessons, right? Depending on the person and the way they spatially think. So this would be, once they get their landings down, they know how to fly the pattern, I've taught them how to enter a pattern, like the procedures to enter a pattern, how they're supposed to do it. We've talked through this before. They've probably seen me do it. Maybe I've walked them through it. We're gonna have a lesson where we just do pattern entries. Because I don't wanna waste my time, you don't wanna waste your time. We gotta learn how to do this. So our goal is enter and fly normal patterns from any starting point to any runway at an airport they know in real time. So I want to be able to drop you in, I want you to figure out where you are, get the weather at the airport, maneuver and get into the pattern. I'm not going to make you fly the pattern or land or anything like that, I just want you to enter. So we'll do a ground brief, we'll start the simulation in there and pause. And early on, I'm going to tell them where they're at. I'm not even walk them through how to do it the first time. And depending on the style of learner they are, pull out a piece of paper, draw it for them, and then have them fly, right? Repeat it. Probably the second time I'll drop them in the exact same place, have them do it. And then we can move them around the airport in different locations, keep the wind the same. They still need to check the ATIS every time, but keep it the same so they can get used to it, and then vary the runway. Once they're good with that and they're able to do it unpaused, so I can just essentially drop them in and unpause the simulator and let them run real time, very rich runway it is. And then vary how far you are, or vary maybe make it a crosswind, where they basically have to choose a runway. And you just repeat it, and in a 1 hour lesson, they may get 20, 25 pattern entries, depending on how quickly you're doing it. Or at least think through it 20 and 25 times. And that will take out a big chunk of that in the airplane, waiting for them to figure it out. This is not an ACS thing, right? And this is not this is just real flying. This is a skill that a lot of people don't have naturally, and the simulator is a great place to teach it, a great place to talk about it. Any questions on this?
I like the fact that it's a small chunk and a single skill, because sometimes some of the scenarios are pretty advanced, and it really requires an investment from the instructor to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Most volunteers are trying to figure that out. I do this, and I also do a lot of work because we're a non-towered airport, so getting my students comfortable with entering a tower field. I'll just say you're somewhere in the vicinity of Nashville, New Hampshire, drop them in, and call me on the tower. I have an external mic plug that I plug in, and I sit outside the sim.
Yeah.
I'm like, on the tower, you're out here, you gotta tell me where you are and how you're getting in. And just repeating it, you can get 10, 12 of those in an hour, and they can become much, much more comfortable.
For sure, that's great. A great example. And it is a good point that you don't need to fly scenarios every time, especially early on in training. It can be really broken down to really narrow skill sets. And one of the things that, let's say somebody's got a 3-hour time block for a lesson, you can do 20 minutes in the sim first, where you just focus on one skill. Even though that flight lesson might involve some other things they've done before, but just do 20 intensive minutes in the simulator beforehand. I mean, there's some scheduling challenges, I get that, but and then go right into the sim, and you can really increase the number of repetitions that they get by doing something like that. Is there another?
Yeah, I teach high school students, and one of the things I do is I've got a briefing form, so when I give them a flight that they have to do, they physically draw out with the airport diagrams between the two airports. I say, visually from top down and from the side plan form, how are you going to fly this? And think about how they're going to enter I won't sign off on the document unless the pattern entry is anywhere close.
Yeah, drawing it out is, she won't mind me saying this, but Patty Bunce, Keith Bunce's wife, who is speaking tomorrow, I think, she came down to Skyport to get her BFR flight review, and I was her instructor. She really struggled with the spatial awareness to figure out, and when I told her just draw it, like that was, but yeah, some people you just gotta draw it out. Okay, so task an IFR1, again, these are, the IFR1s, a lot of times they make more sense to instructors because it's just the culture, I think, and the understanding of it. But this is they know how to fly ILSs, and so what I'm not teaching them how to fly an ILS. This is probably closer towards, I might actually do this before a check ride. It reinforces the procedures of an ILS, partial panel, all that kind of stuff. But what I'm really focusing on is briefing the approach. Because that's a skill that will make the check ride so much easier. And I know that's kind of teaching you the check ride, but a lot of your average instrument check ride is what, 3 back-to-back approaches with 15 minutes tops from when you go miss to when you start the next approach. And that's honestly a skill, to be able to pull up the approach, brief it, get the information out of it, get it into your avionics where you need it, and be mentally prepared to go on to the next one. So we're going to do 6 approaches in this one. We'll start in the ground, we'll start in the air, unpause it right away. Instructor functions as ATC in this environment, in this situation, and we're just going to do vectors. And while I'm giving them vectors, and I may, towards the end, I may kind of vector them. Like one of my preferred things to do in a scenario or a situation like this is maybe on the 5th one or something like that. I'll vector them through the course and see if they say anything to me. And then if they don't, vector them back around and give them some like 50 or 60 degree cut in on it, because that's another skill. The pilot's got to know to advocate for themselves. If ATC is doing that to them, they need to be confident enough to say, and know that they're allowed to say, hey, I don't like this. You're not up here with me, so I would like a better entry on this approach, please. So anyways, we'll do 6 approaches. We'll vary it up. I just put together like some random ones. It doesn't have to be this. Again, the key is going quickly. You want to move this really quick. So as soon as either they land or they go miss, whenever there's a completion to this approach, pop them right back to have it preset and move them right away. And I would never hit the pause button in this flight. I want them just doing it every time, and I want them to do a full brief of the approach. You can do this 6 separate approaches. That would be very difficult. I mean, a lot of good instrument pilots would struggle in that. Bam, 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 6 approaches they've never seen before, pulling up a briefing and doing it that quickly. That would be tough. You could also do it with 1 or 2 approaches, and so they start to understand it, and especially 1 or 2 approaches that you know your DPE uses on the check ride. And it'll really help enforce where their eye needs to go on the approach plate, and build that, because I think everybody briefs a little bit differently, and they take the information from the briefing and put it into the avionics a little bit differently. I've seen pilots that will do it sort of step by step, right? Frequency, altitude, and other pilots will do the whole thing and then try to come back through and do it in the flow. Honestly, I don't think there's one way or the other is necessarily better, but they need to develop, how do I brief it? How do I take that information and deal with it? And then I would do a partial panel. You can do a brief partial panel where you, while it's repausing and resetting, say, I'm going to fail your heading indicator on this approach. And then let them do it. The next one, let them go through that. If I was really thinking about scripting it, I'd probably do the 4th one as a briefed partial panel approach, the 5th one as a vector through final, and the 6th one as an unbriefed partial panel approach. So anyways, any questions on that example IFR? We're getting close on time, so I'm going to try to keep us moving here. What emergency training do you think is most important for a private pilot? Anybody? Okay. Most people, what we teach in private pilot in terms of emergency training is system component failure power plant, and maybe some system component failure non-power plant. Those are not the main proximate cause of fatal accidents, and actually, if you really think about it, that for sure, that's all pilot error, that's all judgment. The actual cause of the accident may be loss of control in flight, but it all boils down to pilot judgment. So, and that's not saying power plant failure, system failure is on the AC, it's on the check ride, you've got to teach it. And it does happen. We need to teach it, but the simulator might be a good place to try to think about teaching some of these other things. And the last slide. Sorry, I rushed through that, but again, the instructor keys to success or checklist. So, questions?
Can I add one more thing in your instructor guidelines?
Sure.
When boy, I'm going to be nasty here, but when two young instructors are using the sim, they got to treat it like it's real airplane. They have to take the thing seriously.
Yeah.
I've seen too many times when they're working around.
Yeah. I would never put two young instructors in the sim together.
But sometimes they do work together.
Yeah, that's a
Walking
recipe.
on them,
Yeah.
I typically don't let students go to the simulator by themselves.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
the reason is, I'm in a formal course, and I know they have standards to meet the next day, and so consequently, that extra set of eyeballs ensures the team right, and we make it a formal requirement. And so, all too often, we've got people that are watching.
Yeah.
So there's added benefits. in that.
One of the things we did at Skyport is we had it's called Insight, which is the camera inside the sim that's recording that, and we put for all four of the sims, we put it on a wall, and so you could have an instructor monitor for students working in the sim at the same time. We weren't in nearly as formalized course as you're in, but in a slightly little more flexibility. If you wanted to have students work independently, especially certain personality types, independent does not mean unmonitored, and so to avoid that kind of thing. Yeah.
Is there a way to set the weather so that it gradually degrades without being so obvious? If we'd like to, the constant control or see fit.
We can. There's a man right there, Kyle. Hey, Kyle. If you have a few in particular you'd like, we can help with that. There's not an easy way right now for the user to do that, but that's one of the things we're working on.
Maybe this is a big question, but I agree with you about the importance of the instructor with getting the buy-in and the customer and being a valuable tool. And the instructors don't believe in a headset that won't sell, right? The instructors don't believe in the simulator that won't sell. How do you sell them on it?
It's hard.
When they want the time in your law book, like you said, all the right things, but how do you just sit them down and
so
it's the best thing for the customer, so if you pay them more for it,
So I honestly, if I had a really good answer for that, I would have. I have thought about it a lot because it is a big problem. But yes, you're on the right path. I personally think the best approach is say, this is your job right now. Is not actually to build time. Your job right now is to help these people achieve their goals. And this is a way that will really help them do it. So while you may not like it, you had to clean your room when you were a kid. So you kind of have to do this, and and it's important for that student that you at least put on a good face, right? And if you can't put on a good face, don't say anything bad. And then, pay them more. That is definitely an approach. Although I will say, at Skyport, we had, money is not always the best motivator with certain generations. And so that doesn't necessarily, some people will respond really well to that. Individuals will, but it is not an easy answer. Like there's a lot of instructors that won't respond well to that.
So the student can log a certain amount of time in flight instruction towards their rating, even though they're not actually in the aircraft. Have you ever looked at trying to see if there'd be a possibility for the FAA to allow the instructor to log some of that time?
Yes.
I mean, that would be a great incentive.
It would, yeah.
And I think it would be hugely beneficial. I mean, I see instructors all day long in my airport. We're just going to do touch and goes today, and they're just going around the pattern. The student's not getting anything out of it. They could get a lot more out of something in the sim if.
We have discussed that with the FAA.
Well, if I can sign the petition.
It's unfortunately it's kind of a non-starter with them right now. But we'll say they for a while. Well, if you need to be somewhere else, go ahead. I'm just going to pontificate. But in 2008, when they came out with the AC 61136 that set up the AATDs, it was incredibly forward-looking of them. we deal with regulatory bodies all over the world, EASA, Australian authorities, and for a regulatory body, the FAA is extremely progressive about this, about simulators. And there were some really good studies that came out that demonstrated the validity of this style of device over, you don't need to spend $1 million and it can still be effective. And they took it and they went in with it. And then we went through a little phase with the FAA where they got the legal department involved, and they said, well, this word is wrong in the regulations, so you gotta cut that time in half. And I think we got through that okay, and we're in a place where in general they're receptive to it, but my feeling is that they're not really interested in expanding credit at this point for this level of device for anybody. The truth is it's a small office. You're talking about 5 or 6 people that are in charge of this type of thing, and a lot of it is personality based and sort of bias based where they come from. Yeah.
We have an 18-year-old student that he has his private instrument and just got his commercial, and using the Redbird simulator saved him almost $6,000.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how wonderful is that?
The funny thing is, too, the further you progress along, if you choose to become a professional pilot, the more training you're going to do in sim. I just got a Global Express type rating.
Yeah.
And I'm rated. I go out and jump in the airplane and fly it.
Yeah.
But the only difference really is the landings are a little different.
Yeah.
And maybe the switch is a little more authentic.
Yeah.
But the learning that happens there can happen in the Redbird too. And instructors won't appreciate that till they get to that point and they look back and say, man, I wish I had made better use of that tool. Yeah.
I'm going to counter what you just said a little bit. The $6,000 comment and value add, if you can get a Signify to understand that they will get somebody on the back end. If you just save them $6,000, they will stay with you until you decide you don't want to be an instructor anymore.
Sure.
And you've got to get it. And this is turning into, the whole time builder argument, okay? You can convince a flight instructor that, as you just said, they're not here to build time. They get time as a benefit. And get them to understand that this is how proper training occurs. It's a win-win-win all the way around.
For
Now,
sure.
that's a problem with the industry, not with simulators.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, thank you everybody. I appreciate your time.